but at different intervals and times. And if we don't know the history that has went through time from the beginning through this period of time, then we lose sight to these things. So we'll just accept translators, Dr. Schofield and all the rest of them, and go on merrily down the road believing in a traditional picture. So my point is the word great, as it's mentioned right there, didn't say the great tribulation. It says they came out of great. That means many times over the history of time and church, there has been uprisings through different nations that has produced this great multitude. And you know and I know, Christianity, brothers and sisters, is not running in full swing in the original nations where it started. It's here in the Western Hemisphere of this planet. It's here predominant, but I can see it's closing out. And I have to say, when God has seen and sealed the last one that's to be in that bride of Christ, then that angel that was seen in the 7th chapter flying from the east, he's on his way home. There'll never be another soul saved in the bride of Christ for the bride. And neither will there, brothers and sisters, be another tribulation saint to take the place there. That's all established back here. He goes through this period of time, and with the Jews and the foolish virgins in this period of time, over here is where they're martyrdom. But that's only applicable on 1/4 part of the earth. Because, brothers and sisters, when you take communism, that's influenced China and the whole Eastern Orient today. Don't tell me that Rome is going to dictate to China how many to kill and how many to slaughter and such. Communism will tell the Pope to go to the dogs. You know that. So that's why I have to say, we've got to start looking at these scriptures. What do they declare? What do they present to you and I as a picture? Now then, and I'm going to, by the grace of God, I want to show you. This period of time is going to be a terrible tribulation period. But it's not of the magnitude that it has been when this was killed. I've got the history of these periods of time when thousands absolutely was beheaded, burned at the stake, fed to the lions. And it was not all over the world at the same time. In some places it was preeminently more important there. But as time and the gospel begins to fade from there, it rises in another portion of the earth. So we've got to understand, time conditions fluctuate. And these people, brothers and sisters, are the product of many periods of tribulation. And when you look at it all, yes, it amounts to one terrible tribulation. And I'll have to say, any human being that has to be killed or slaughtered, butchered, tortured, dismembered, that's a tribulation to him. And you have to be under a dictatorship for that to be brought about. We want to show to you, brothers and sisters, that this last 3.5 years, it's a tribulation. But keep in mind, this is not a tribulation period necessarily just to make life miserable for the saints. People will say, yes, these are here that are foolish virgins on this side and the Jews. They're going to be killed. But I'll have to say, they'll be killed shortly after this period begins. That's why, brothers and sisters, their spirits are seen standing here. God separates these from this. Because these stand out specifically, they only represent from this period of time. But this is tribulation saints from all the eras of time, from the beginning of Christendom, straight through to this period of time. Now, let's go back to the book of Matthew. There are certain things, the way Jesus said it in Matthew 24, For too long, we preachers have absolutely looked back upon Matthew 24 as though what he said is more or less irrelevant to how we see this whole picture. But I'll have to say, brothers and sisters, when we start dealing with the first church age, Jesus was speaking here of conditions and things that was going to slowly begin to develop and rise through time, that would affect the growth of Christendom wherever it was represented. In Matthew 24, Jesus then has just been speaking to the disciples of that hour, the living disciples. He says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. Too many times people have looked at this as though some great big object is built. Has nothing to do with that at all. The two words put together mean a time of excessive hatred, when there is a spirit set forth by the devil to deprive a certain place of its inhabitants. That's what it all means. That's why it says, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing or existing in the holy place against the holy temple. Whoso readeth. Now, brothers and sisters, we have to learn to not only read the Bible, but history. And a lot of Christians are not even interested in history. It's a dull subject. So that makes it easy for them to just be fit anything. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Now then, these doctors of divinity today, or these preachers who are supposed to be preaching prophecy, and trying to tell you that the Bible don't show you that there's a rapture, that we've all got to go through tribulation and face death. It's because, brothers and sisters, they don't even read the scriptures right. That's why I have to say, brothers and sisters, the book of Revelation is not for the church world. Any carnal man can read it. But it's going to take a Holy Ghost-filled person or people to see who's in it that's speaking to them. And if what I'm saying is the truth, and God has put it in my soul for the benefit of people, then I don't have to worry about who's going to believe it. Because there's going to be a spirit in the heart of the people. They're going to see the picture. It's supposed to be that way. When we see in the book of Revelation, and it's the only prophetic scriptures that words like that the testimony of Jesus Christ in that day will be the spirit of prophecy. You don't read that anywhere else in the epistles of Paul or in the Old Testament. That's why in the last chapter of the book of Revelation, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Well, for a long time, brothers and sisters, if anybody would say, we're the bride, they're saying that only from a theological term. But brothers and sisters, that's not from a theological term. That's from a revelatory term. They see themselves reflected in this letter, because it's his personal letter of love to be dictated and interpreted at the ending of time to a living element of people who will have the true testimony of Jesus Christ, because it is a revelation of him in their hearts. Now, if it was important for the disciples then to listen tentatively to what he's saying and the words that he said, then it's just as important for you and I today to see what he said to us. Because these words now he's saying, when you therefore, now he was talking to that generation of disciples. He's not talking to the generations down here. He's talking to them. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. That has nothing to pertain to you and me. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out. Again, that's to the Jewish disciples. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. So all of that is pertaining to disciples that lived geographically throughout the Israeli area for that generation. If he's concerned about that generation of Christians, to tell them how to watch for this so they can escape it, why should he show more love to them when they had saw him in the flesh? and had heard these words in the flesh. Do we doubt the fact then that he don't love us just as much? That's why I have to say. So let's go on. And woe unto them that are with child. That has nothing to do to pertain to the Christians of today. And to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Now we come to another a traditional scripture. For then, and your translators take that and jump it down here. Because of the word great. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now, it sounds like, but Brother Jackson, that's got to be at the end time. It's not the end time. I got Jewish history here. We'll tell you how that was fulfilled. Who it pertained to. Over here, brothers and sisters, when we come to this part, Jerusalem has been on the process of being rebuilt and the temple's built. And when we come down to here, brothers and sisters, over here when the tribulation is over, this temple is still standing and the city is still standing. And there ain't been one stone turned upside down. Now think of it. And the only people, brothers and sisters, that leave that area is the 144,000 and the woman. And where did they hear the message at? Over here in the beginning of that week. So they're nowhere around when this era opens up. Think of it. This is an era of the wrath of God. What are these vials? It's God's wrath using nature. Because he is dealing with fallen mankind, sinners of the world, atheists, evolutionists. He's angry with them. And he's no longer in the process of saving flesh. He's already, brothers and sisters, used a miracle war to open the eyes of a mortal realm. And that's why the 144,000 are preaching the everlasting gospel to another element of the mortal realms of the world. So they can escape these things and this. We've got to read it right and see the picture right. It is a time of tribulation. But it's not a time of tribulation that God is trying to save human flesh out of mercy. How many understand my point? No, sir. So now let's go back here what Jesus was saying then. For then shall be great tribulation. When? You see the abomination that maketh desolate. Such as were not since the beginning of the world. To this time no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened, and that was an element of the physical Jewish people that would be caught in that city. And it was a great tribulation. It was a time, brothers and sisters, when the angry of Satan rose up in that Roman emperor system. This is a history. It's ancient history. The editor of it is Blossus, Ancient History, printed in 1878. You don't get many historians today that goes into details. In our time, like some of these men did. These men who wrote history back then, they had a knowledge of the Bible. And they knew how to acquaint certain scriptures of the Bible with the events of the world. And it tells you right in here, brothers and sisters, I don't mean to take up a lot of your time. Through the number of histories that I've read, Jerusalem fell to one in 69 AD. To another is 70 AD. Well, right here, brothers and sisters, it was in the spring of 70 AD that Titus prepared to launch his all-out offensive against Jerusalem. The conflict has already been going on for several months. And finally the walls was overcame, demolished. And the Romans had fought for months and months. They'd worked so hard. And the history declares for 5 miles back in every direction, every tree was cut down, every house was demolished. And all of that rubbish was brought against Jerusalem to build a great big parapet of junk, to raise an artificial wall of dirt and junk and rubbish so that the Roman soldiers could be on top of it to shoot across at the walls and the Jews that sit on the walls. And at night, when they could throw all of this over and kept moving this wall closer, then it succeeded, brothers and sisters, eventually, in places, they was able to get this wall of dirt and stuff right against the walls, and they threw their ladders across the gap, and they entered the city. And they set things on fire. They set the temple on fire. The orders of Vespasian at first was, don't destroy the city, don't destroy the temple. We're here just to put down this Jewish revolt. But after months had went by, and the Jews fought so ferociously and killed so many Roman soldiers, then the Roman soldiers became so infuriated at the Jews, they got where they didn't even listen at the commands. They went after to demolish, to tear down, to torture, to kill, to slay. And when they finally come then to the inner walls that goes around the temple, and Titus says, don't hurt the temple. But then one Roman soldier was so mad, he picked up a burning piece of wood, and he threw it over a wall. And it landed in an area where it set some of the curtains on fire. And in a short order of time, the temple was on fire. Well, when they seen the big flames, then the Roman soldiers couldn't be held. They broke through the walls into the temple, and by this time everything was on fire. And what did Jesus say in Matthew 24 in the very beginning? The day will come when there will not be one stone in thee left upon another, but what shall all be brought down. And it says when the fire subsided, and the gold and the silver and all the ornamentation has melted and poured onto the marbleized stones, the Roman soldiers took their spears and swords and pried the stones up and dug out the melted gold and silver, fulfilling the very words of Jesus. It tells me right here, when the Jews then finally surrendered, the city was in ruins. The temple was demolished. And I'm going to read the words. As Titus went around the city on the outside looking at the extent of it, over the walls into the valley of Hinnom, all through these months of hunger, starvation, and fighting, 1 million Jews have perished inside this. And they threw their bodies over the walls. 1 million Jews, he estimated. It's the number right here. And when things settled down, they separated out of what was left, the healthiest, the young, 100,000. And they marched towards Rome. And they sold them on 3 slave markets. Some was sent to Cairo, Egypt. Some was sent to Constantinople. And the others in Rome. And the only people they left in Jerusalem was the sick, the old, the handicapped. And the days of vengeance had been completed. Just a small element had been saved physically. How many understand the point? It was a period of great tribulation. But it's not pointing over here to the end of time. How many realize that? Because actually when you begin to trace this, brothers and sisters, at the ending of time, it's a tribulation period, but it's got a different nature and effect that God has ordained. The only people that God is concerned about is getting an element of mortal people to wake up and get out of this spirit that's dominating the world right now and start believing and trusting that there is a God that rules in the heavens. And he's going to come out the victor in the end. And that's why, brothers and sisters, the everlasting gospel has to be preached by the 144,000 Jews in that last 3.5 years of time. So don't say it is not a tribulation period. It is. But it's God using the elements of nature to begin to speak back to mortal, unbelieving, hypocritical, sinful men. Because, brothers and sisters, not only is this era climaxed by the Battle of Armageddon, he gathers them into the Hebrew tongue, into the place of Armageddon. It's into his winepress, and the blood will flow to the bridle of the horse. You see that, brothers and sisters, in the book of Revelation. So it is a war. 200 million men will be involved in it. Is God interested now in preserving human flesh? No. Because he knows exactly there's an element he's after at mortally. The rest can go to the dogs. Because he's going to torment men with sores and boils and all kinds of plagues and pestilences. He's got the world shook up today. The number of SARS is now 4,000. It's got the doctors all over the world. Well, let them scratch their heads. Well, Brother Jackson, you ought to be concerned. Well, I knew this was coming a long time ago. Did they absolutely tell the people to stop their lifestyle when the AIDS broke out? But the old-timers that smoked long green 2 years gone by, man, they went to great extent, brothers and sisters, to pass laws. Stop smoking. It creates cancer of the lungs. But what in the world does AIDS do? Young babies, brothers and sisters, are wandering the streets of African villages because the adults are dying like flies. Babies wandering half naked, starved to death. And they too have got AIDS. World leaders are responsible for it. Let them pass laws to change their lifestyle. I don't agree with smoking, but neither do I agree with all this other hellish stuff. You can't call one thing black and the other white. When people start living like that and interpreting things like that, they only build themselves into a dilemma. Now, I want to take this morning, and it says right here as I close this record, Jerusalem fell the 10th of August, 70 A.D. Now, if you've got a history that reads 69 A.D., I am not going to argue with you. I have to say it's all of the historians. Can they get time in the proper chronology? Now then, let's go back. Because we've got to understand, brothers and sisters, what did Jesus say and what did he mean as the era of Christendom starts in 33 A.D. and coming on through time? I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it's important to notice how this thing breaks down. When the disciples came to him over on the Mount of Olives and said, "Tell us when these things shall be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world." And the first thing Jesus said was, "Take heed that no man deceive you." And you know, that's been the truth all through the ages. From the first age right even up till now. Because just as sure there was true apostles and ministers of the first age, the devil produced the counterfeit, the negative. For many shall come in my name, saying, "I am Christ, I'm anointed," and shall deceive many. Mislead. Deceptive words. It's how they use it. A man that came into the church yesterday, a man told me, he met a fellow down here in the mall yesterday. He was asked, "Would you happen to know William Branham?" And he said, "Yes." And he began to rejoice. "Well, I have met his son, Joseph. He's the Messiah." And he just went down through the them all celebrating. That's another deceptive spirit. Brother Branham, brothers and sisters, fought against that when he preached the sermon, the bruised serpent. For in the dream he saw himself shoot that thing and it crawled back in the waters. He thought at that time it would die, but it didn't die. Snakes sometimes are hard to kill. They lay around to recover. And so now that here is that devilish thing, brothers and sisters, on one of his own son that will sit and tolerate it. The best he could do would be to make an open statement of rebuking it. They came here and passed their tracts out, set them on our windshields and everything through the years of time. So, brothers and sisters, that's a warning. Take heed. Wake up. Don't give your ears to every Tom, Dick, and Harry that comes down the road carrying a Bible or a book. Now then, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. That's been all through time. Look at the epistles that the Apostle Paul wrote. And how many times he's rebuking certain characters for what they preached and taught. And that carries all straight through our day. But when we come to this next verse, and ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. There's always been wars. Armies fighting armies. Be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So let's come to the ages of time. But when we come to this 7th verse, for a nation shall rise against nation. This marks a precisely difference in our time structure. For a nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines, and pestilence, and earthquakes in divers places. All of these are the beginnings of sorrows. He's not even referring back to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. He's coming to the 20th century. Brother Jackson, can you prove that? He said, all these are the beginnings of sorrows. And Daniel 12 says, and there shall be a time of trouble. Yes, it all consummates here. Right here, and the coming of the Lord brings it all to end. But that's not necessarily where it all starts. It all starts back here within the last 100 years. Because the last 100 years is the Laodicean church age. Now then, let me read you something. This man who compiles this little book, he is a historian. He tells you what happened when we come into the era of World War II. And he looked at Matthew 24. And I can see the man. He just threw his hands. He says, we're living in the last days. And he couldn't stay away from the Bible. What did Jesus call this stuff? All these are the beginnings of sorrows. He was not talking about from here to here. He's talking about from here to the end. That's what he's talking about. Now, you young people that's went to school, you've studied about the colonial era. What was behind the colonial era? It all starts way back in the early 1800s. When the nations of Europe have fought and fought and fought through centuries of time. They never got nowhere. Because God would not allow one nation in Europe to dominate the whole continent. So there will be wars and rumors of wars, but it didn't bring the end at all. So then, brothers and sisters, in the 18th century, they all begin to decide. Britain goes here, the Dutch goes here, the Belgians go here, the French goes here. Did you ever hear of French Morocco? Then the Spanish Moroccans? The Dutch East Indies? The sun never sets on a British flag? The Germans, they go also to the Mediterranean. French Equatorial Africa. The British in South Africa. The British in India. France in Vietnam. All of these horns, they go to the areas of the world and take a domain. And I have seen, brothers and sisters, the effect of some of what the colonial era have done. I'm not saying that the colonial era was all evil. But I've rode on some of the trains in India. And I want to poke my finger at the man who went on the long fast and threatened to bring his life to an end. And yep, it brought the end of the downfall of the British Empire in India. But I want to tell you something. Who built the railroads? Because I've been in India, from Bangkok, Bombay, to Madras. That country, that whole area of India is internet with a network of trains. And when that train pulls out of the stations, there's poor Indians hanging on to them flat cars. So I have to say, supposing the British had never got there, what would they be riding on today? Think of it. I say give credit where credit's due. And you miserable bunch of politicians and historians, the day will come when you'll hang your head in shame. Because you don't write it as it really should be written. When World War II was over, I heard a Belgian missionary say, they went into the Congos of Africa. They taught a lot of these natives an education. They built schools. They cut roads through the jungles to educate some of these tribal people and to try to Christianize them. But when they left, the jungle roads began to grow up. And they stopped using the schoolhouses. And they turned them into chicken houses, into hog pens. I'm not saying that to poke a finger. I believe giving credit where credit's due. We've got a bunch of educated people today, brothers and sisters. If they had their way, they say, give America back to the Indians. Yes, and let them beat their drums and paint their faces and dance their war dances. And burn their dead on brush piles. Turn America back into a devil-possessed hornet's nest. They believe in a great white spirit. And yet turn around and fight each other and cut each other's throat. I have to say, I don't rejoice in ignorance. Give credit where people have been given an opportunity to wake up. Now then, when Jesus said, and when you hear of wars, nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes in diverse places. When we turn the 20th century, starting into 1900, Russia was already in a revolution. The Bolshevik. Communism was on the march. And from then, brothers and sisters, till 1918, that land of Russia absolutely went through a tribulation, slaughterhouse period. And those that were true Christians were slaughtered and butchered. And their number is represented right there. Some of them. Those that meet the requirements of the bride, they're there. Now you say, well, Brother Jackson, distinguish between the two. What constitutes this and what constitutes that? That man, that woman that meets this, he's lived long enough to develop his life into a fruitful life, that his life begins to reflect the indwelling Christ from a revelatory standpoint. He's just not a person that's following tradition. He's got a personal relationship with the Lord. That's the best way you can look at it. He's represented out of every age from the time of the early Christendom. And early Christendom, brothers and sisters, Stephen was one of the deacons stoned to death. Then James was pushed over the tower at the temple. They were Jews. They already knew something. And I have to say, it was a Jewish religious system that set many of them early Christians to their doom. But that don't mean that all died like that. Some lived on through to 69 AD and 70. And those that did, they had the revelation of what Jesus said in Matthew 24. When you see this, then get out of here. That's exactly, brothers and sisters, how Saudi Arabia became a land all through the 2nd and 3rd century that had became gospelized with early Christians that had came out of Jerusalem. That's where most of them fled to. So my point is, brothers and sisters, early Christendom started out, the Jews persecuted them. And many of them were in this multitude. They wound up with great white linen. Fine linen. But also, this is representative of the different eras coming from here all to time. Well, who is that man or woman? I thought they were all going to be bride. Keep in mind, the Gospels written by Paul was all written with the understanding it's to produce the church, the called out, the bride of Christ. Not a thing in there written. And it'll produce one category here and another category there. How many realize that? But you and I have got to have sense enough to realize God's the final judge. And when we come out of that first age, and time and the church begins to move into different centuries, some of these people was not even allowed to live long enough to develop a fruitful, Holy Ghost, Spirit-filled, led life. And we're deceiving ourselves if we close our eyes to reality. I have to say, shame on us. We've been walking on thin ice because it's just tradition. We'll go to sleep and sleep with that. I can see. Don't tell me, brothers and sisters, that everybody is called to be a Christian when they're 13 years of age. All through the centuries, or some are just as bullheaded as Jackson has been. I grew up to have a knowledge about the Lord. I was raised in a household of Methodist thinkers. But my ideas of life was, I never wanted to be too religious. Don't get too close to the Bible. It causes you to go insane. That's what I used to think. But I'll tell you, brothers and sisters, when the Lord gets after you with the two before, He knows absolutely how to get your attention. It's like the old man one time, he says, there's a mule, will do anything you ask him to do. Oh, he's gentle. But as he put the harness on him, he'll hold up and hit him and knock him down. And the man said, well, you said he was gentle. I thought you said he would do anything. Well, you have to get his attention first. That's most of us. God has to get our attention to wake us up what we're looking at. So with these thoughts in our mind, as these eras of persecution arose in different centuries of time, brothers and sisters, think of the number of people that has just, we will say, surrendered their heart to the Lord and have not been allowed to live long enough until they was rounded up, put in prison, and then they faced the lion's den, the fires, or being beheaded. They never had a chance to live, to develop their lives into a fruitful life. Remember, the Matthew 13, the 7 parables, they coincide along with this revelation. Each parable overshadows an age. And the first parable Jesus talked about was like how the sower went forth to sow seed. And some fell by the wayside. Some fell among stony ground. Some fell amongst thorns, but others fell on good soil. All of this represents a different category of societies. So as we look at that, brothers and sisters, keep in mind, God has known how to show mercy, because he sees the heart of the person. And I have to say, when the authorities came along to arrest many of these people, and when we come into the second age, the first age did not have near the martyrdom that the second age had. And brother, they rounded them up by the hundreds and the thousands. Because the Roman Empire at that time, we're going to get rid of this new cult. We're going to bring it to an end. But the more they killed, in the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, there's one episode. And the Romans at that time, they loved to put on these exhibitions. And they would notify it. And on certain days, they would say, we're going to absolutely feed so many. And in that was a lot of the Jews, as well as early Christians. But keep in mind, in that category of Christians, you could have older ones that have lived long enough to develop their lives into a spiritual walk with the Lord. But you got younger ones, or you got those that have not served the Lord and did not know anything about him for long enough to really develop a Christian, godly walk with the Lord. How many understands that? We are responsible for our own ignorance. How we try to supervise this thing and bring it down to fit our own ideology. We've got to stop it. And brothers, they turn the lines loose. And as they come at these victims, yes, in one episode, here stood these saints in the arenas as the lions was lunging. Instead of these people crying and screaming, keep in mind, brothers and sisters, you remember the beast that had the face like unto an ox? How Brother Branham described that? That's how the power of God come down upon the early Christians. And put in them a willingness just to submit themselves to be sacrificed. And just like Stephen laying there, I see heaven open. And Jesus standing on the right hand of the Father. He no longer felt the pains. His face lit up with a smile. And as the Roman spectators sat there in the bleachers and watched these Christians begin to sing, they would sing it to the Lord as his glory was overshadowing them, giving them grace to die, and the animals tearing limb, muscles, nerves, and everything. And the Roman spectators sat there. Instead of hearing them scream, they were singing glories, hallelujah to the Lord. Out of the bleachers here they came, crying, I want to die with them. I want to die like them. So my brothers and sisters, around the world wherever you hear this, wake up to the reality. God is merciful. Sure, them old pagans went into the arenas. They too was ripped and tore a piece by beast, or they might have been set afire and burnt. But when that spirit left that body, it went into the presence of the Lord. And I have to say, brothers and sisters, they are represented in that great multitude. Don't forget it. But those older ones that has lived long enough, developed something other that's pleasing in the eyes of God, they are represented in that great bride of Christ. And they come out of all ages. But remember, the gospel has not always been present in every area of the earth at the same time. Now I realize I'm going to read you something to get this into the message. How this writer, as we come into the 20th century, 1900, here's the beginning of Pentecost. The Laodicean age starts. But diplomatically, politically, and militarily, it's the era of the breaking up of the colonial era. Guerrilla warfare begins to start. Communism in Russia. Political men of the world begin to think different. And brothers and sisters, as nation after nation and their power outreach begin to crumble, one by one they begin to come home. Well, World War I started. It ended in 1918. It only introduced to the world the beginning of the time of sorrows. One lone dictator rose up, Kaiser Wilhelm, and he plunged all Europe into a conflict. It reached to Austria. When it was ended in November 1918, they thought it's done forever. Brother, 20 years, that old spirit just lay there and fermented. Right in the same area that started World War I. In 1933, Hitler came to his position. 6 years later, he started the war that started that time of sorrows. I'm going to read to you how this writer saw it. The voice of King George VI trembled with emotion when on September the 3rd, 1939, he announced the declaration of war. A strange sensation swept over me. This is the man that's the writer. When I heard the king say, "This war cannot be compared to any conflict in past history." When army met army on the battlefield, for the first time in man's history, it is a war of nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. King George VI said that. Reaching for the Bible on my desk, I opened quickly to the passage where Christ described the events at the end of the age. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. That's been through time. That's all through the dark ages. See that you be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Now I'm going to show you, brothers and sisters, the last 100 years brought Matthew 24 right at your doorstep. I've got to read this, because a lot of Christian people don't have access to these things. I arose from my chair by the fireplace to throw another log on the fire, and I said to myself, how little do my sons, sleeping peacefully in the rooms above, know of the horrors of World War II. Over half the generation now living was not alive when World War II came to its close. Few indeed care to glance at the calendar of yesterday with its vivid reminder of the awful expanses of World War II. Here's the domain of time. September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. September the 3rd, 1939, Britain and Australia, New Zealand, France declared war on Germany. September the 6th, 1939, South Africa declared war on Germany. September the 10th, 1939, Canada declared war on Germany. April the 9th, 1940, Germany invaded Norway and Denmark. May the 10th, 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. June the 10th, 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain. June the 11th, 1940, France and Britain declared war on Italy. June the 22nd, 1941, Germany and Romania invaded Russia. December the 7th, 1941, Britain declared war on Finland, Hungary, and Romania. December the 7th, 1941, Japan declared war on the United States. Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa. December the 8th, 1941, United States, France, and Great Britain declared war on Japan. December the 11th, 1941, Italy and Germany declared war against the United States. December the 11th, 1941, the United States declared war against Italy and Germany. December the 13th, 1941, Britain declared war on the Netherlands. June the 5th, 1942, United States declared war against Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. December the 25th, 1942, Britain declared war on Thailand. October the 13th, 1945, Italy declared war against Germany. July the 14th, 1945, Italy declared war on Japan. August the 8th, 1945, Russia declared war on Japan. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, government against government, and you have had nothing but turmoil ever since. I remember in October 1945, yes, the war against Japan was over. A second lieutenant blew his whistle one morning, and we all assembled out on a grassy knoll, and he had a bunch of papers. And he says, these have just came through from the State Department. And he didn't read the articles, but he just more or less broke them down and gave us the gist of the thought. He says, this is to declare that there has been the formation of what they call the United Nations. It's believed by the leaders and the founders that has formulated this, that this is going to be an era of time when the nations of the world can become a member of this body of nations, but function like the United States. And the objective and the purpose of this is, it's believed that this means that we've just fought the war that ends all wars. Huh. It wasn't long. It broke out in Korea. Then Vietnam. And then it swings to Africa. And brothers and sisters, it's been nothing but war, internal. 1948, out of the mountains came Mao Tung and Chow Enlai. And brothers and sisters, when the communist regime went in Russia, they butchered Christians there by the millions. Now let's try to understand. Some of them wound up in this category. And some of them wound up in that category. But you've got to understand, how's God looking at the two categories? How many can see that? And then in 1948, when out of the mountains came Mao Tung and Chow Enlai, again millions of Christians have been slaughtered. Up at Sellersburg in the 50s, I remember at a church up there, they showed some slides. And this missionary had just escaped China. And he said, word had finally reached him that when communism came in, and began to settle in the different communities, and they rounded up the Christians to slay them, or to give them a chance to renounce. He said word came through eventually. Many of the Chinese Christians, rather than deny their faith, now they have to have something in them to make them do this. They went and cut their tongues off so they could no longer talk. No matter how they were tortured, they could not utter a word. Therefore, they could not confess and deny the Lord that has saved them. Let's settle it, brothers and sisters. Some of them went in that multitude right there. Because to them in that era, that was great tribulation. How many realize that? But some of them also absolutely wound up in that. God's the judge. But he gives you and I a letter to read and to see where we are in time. So now, brothers and sisters, I'm 5 minutes past. But I have to say, when we begin to see the picture come together like it should be, Now in the morning, I want to take and show you how we break down the first 3 chapters of this letter of Revelation. It deals from 33 A.D. right straight on through to the end, to the coming of Jesus Christ. And I have to say, brothers and sisters, if you don't mind, we have just saw a war in Iraq that involves some of the most high technology of warfare that could ever be. Yes, it produced sort of a miracle war. I'm going to read to you what it cost the world in World War II. And this was one of the largest masses of military equipment and men throughout the whole campaign of the European War. On June the 6th, 1944, my friend Colonel Algar crossed the Channel on D-Day morning. Ernest Hemingway was at his side. He's a writer. You heard of him. In this salt craft. Gar, a chief ordnance officer with the First Army, described the amazing sight. 1,000 planes and gliders, 2,400 U.S. and British bombers, 5,049 fighter planes, 3,467 heavy bombers, 1,645 light and medium bombers, 2,316 transport aircraft. That's what dropped paratroopers. 2,591 gliders, 4,000 ships, 2,876,439 troops was involved. That's D-Day in Europe. The end of World War II from both the enemy and the Allies. The total loss of life was 16,933,000 soldiers died in combat. And the total number of civilians killed by bombing was 34,305,000 civilians perished. These are the beginnings of sorrows. I have to say, I'm thankful to God for His Word. And brothers and sisters, if we can see it in its right setting, it tears tradition all to pieces, don't it? And I realize this. You're not going to get the church world to believe none of it. But I'm glad, brothers and sisters, we know what 6 seals contain. It points us back to what has been through 5 seals. But it gives us the revelation of what that 6th seal is. And right there it is. Because the 6th seal and the 7th trumpet and the 7th vial is all the wrath of God. Brothers and sisters, I'm thankful to the Lord for every one of you. Heavenly Father, take these words this morning. You put them together to form a picture of understanding in our minds. And may, Lord, this prophetic letter become a reality to each one of us, that we can see our day and see our hour. May we learn to be grateful to you, Lord, for the gift of life that you've extended to us so mercifully. Bless my brothers and my sisters. Help each one who face a trial, a test, a circumstance. Lord, you deliver them and set them free. Lead us now, Lord, in the other services that are to be. We ask and thank you now in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. And may the Lord bless all of you, brothers and sisters.